more Gators Breakdown? Join Gators Breakdown Plus. Starting at $3 a month, get access to unique episodes, plus a blog, chat room, giveaways, shout-outs, and more. Gators Breakdown Plus is furthering the interaction with fans and listeners like you. Head to GatorsBreakdown.supportingcast.fm to join Gators Breakdown Plus today. Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Joining me this week, Will Miles, as always. You can find him at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. And Nick Knudsen back joining us here from American Football Stories and Read and Reaction as well. Gentlemen, I hope we'll start with you, but man, I hope you had a very nice Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. It was rainy up here in Philadelphia and like 40 degrees. So whenever you got to turn the heat on during Memorial Day weekend, I don't know. For some of you all who live in Florida, you're probably a little bit jealous because it's about to turn into that season in June and July where it's pretty miserable and it's raining every day down there. But so it was a good weekend. It's always good to have those 3 days. Good to sort of be able to relax and hang out. And really, it's the beginning of baseball season from a playoff perspective. So out there cleaning the fields, making sure they're dry, throwing Diamond Dry on those things all weekend long. So it was fun though.
Baseball season for your kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So my son, especially my 9-year-old's obsessed. So we're out there all the time, chucking the ball around and out at the cages. So I have a bunch of waterlogged baseballs to prove it, man.
Nick, man, it's been a while. Of course, you joined us back earlier in the spring, or not soon after the season was over. But welcome back.
Thanks for the invite, Dave. Solid Memorial Day on my end. Just pretty classic grill and spent a bunch of hours in the pool. So a solid weekend over here.
Yeah, that's what I did Saturday, and then under the weather Sunday and Monday. So I got plenty in on Saturday though to make up for Sunday, Monday. So all good on that end. But gentlemen, we are talking this episode, and Will and I had discussed this episode a couple of weeks ago. I was like, look, there's really no pressure on Dan Mullen, so I didn't want to create a storyline or a headline just for the sake of it. I was like, there's no real pressure on Dan Mullen for the 2021 season, but how can we approach that? And Will was like, pressure points. That's what we can do. So, it'd be pressure points looking toward the 2021 season. And what that means for the future. Could be good, could be bad, but there are, I think, aspects of 2021 in this team that we can look at that can create some pressure or set up for a pretty good future for Dan Mullen. But also, guys, today we didn't know we'd be able to discuss new contracts. So a lot of headlines there made throughout Gator Nation, but plenty to discuss. We'll get into it. We'll get into all that. But one more thing before we get started. Big shout out to the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord chat. That thing is on fire. So everybody, if you want to join Gators Breakdown Plus, you heard the ad before this episode, about $3 a month. Just look it up, GatorsBreakdown.supportingcast.fm. Starts at $3 a month. That chat there, everybody who's in there knows who you are, keeping that chat on fire. It's a lot of fun talking football with a lot of you Gator fans out there. Remember, you can find Gators Breakdown at news4jax.com or your favorite podcast platform. If you're on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Really helps us out, helps people find Gators Breakdown and all the good storylines we get to discuss all summer long heading in to the football season. So, guys, let's get into topic of the day. Dan Mullen's contract, and he'll receive a raise and have his contract extended through the 2026-27 football season. Was originally scheduled to expire the 2023-24 season. Dan Mullen said, "We are very excited about the future of the Florida football program, and this agreement allows us to continue to build on the success we have enjoyed on and off the field. We want to thank the UAA board, President Fox, Director of Athletics Scott Strickland, and the entire University of Florida community for their support." This raise will bring his total average pay over 6 years from $6.1 to $7.6 million, including a $500,000 signing bonus this year. Bonus portion of his contract was suspended last year due to the pandemic. Scott Strickland says Dan has done a tremendous job in his 3 seasons at Florida. We are fortunate to have someone with his obvious talents and head coaching experience leading our football program. I look forward to working alongside him to support his vision for Gators football and our student athletes for many years. Here's the big takeaway from this, guys. This makes Dan Mullen the 5th highest paid coach in college football, behind Jim Harbaugh, Jimbo Fisher, Dabo Swinney, Ed Orgeron, and Nick Saban. There's your top 5. That was one big takeaway. We'll have to get this out of the way. I saw a lot on Twitter. I've seen it in the YouTube chat as well. Why now? Why was it announced now? This was done last year, and Florida did not feel right of putting it out during a pandemic, COVID year of, hey, we're giving all this money to a football coach now when everybody's out there doesn't know what the future holds out there. We've kind of discussed that here on the podcast before. This is nothing new, but Florida kind of maybe doing their due diligence and just waiting to announce. Dan Mullen was going to get this extension after the first 2 years, put on hold, earmarked about a year later for 2021 and the announcement then. But a lot to take away from there, Will.
Yeah, well, I mean, apparently this actually got announced because of some Freedom of Information Act requests from the media out there, which is why they were able to sort of bury the lead with Dan Mullen's extension coming right on top of Mike White's extension. So at least that sort of split the news of Mike White, because most people were like, okay, Mullen got extended. That's great. But White getting extended, we'll see about that one. My initial thoughts are, wow, I should have been a football coach, $7.6 million per year. But I think this makes sense on a bunch of levels, right? So having a 4-year window is important for recruits. Seeing Mullen signed until 2026 gives me some confidence that he's going to be at Florida long term. I think it's important for Mullen. I mean, he's making more than just about all, I think more than everybody but 11 NFL head coaches, which means, all the talk about NFL interest over the offseason, that sort of stuff. This extension really makes it financially beneficial for him to stay in college, because he's probably not going to jump into the top third of head coaches from a compensation perspective in the NFL. And so he's not going to jump because of money at that point. And, this makes it a little bit harder financially if Florida wishes to let him go, but it's not impossible. And it's really rewarding a guy who's delivered the best 3-season stretch in Gators football since Urban Meyer was on the sidelines. And so, anybody who's questioning this, I think, is sort of looking at it through the LSU game last year, the Alabama game, the Oklahoma game, the way the season ended. But, Doug Nussmeier's not calling plays on the sideline anymore, and I'm extraordinarily thankful for that. And Dan Mullen's a big part of that. And if it costs an extra, $1.5 million to make sure that we don't have an offense like that on the field again, I'm all for it.
Nick, I'm glad Will said that, maybe looking through the LSU lens, end of season lens there, because that was something, there was a conversation on Twitter there that I had, and somebody started listing an SEC coach's ranking. And he was like, I'm not even sure Dan Mullen's in the top 6 or 7. I was like, hold on now. I was like, I'm disappointed with the end of 2020, but let's not let those last few games kind of cloud our judgment of what's going on here.
Yeah, big Sam Pittman guy, I guess, if he's not pulling down the 6th spot or something. But look, I think Mullen has almost been, as much as this fan, I love this fan base, and it's extremely passionate. We expect to score 50 and shut people out. Like, we want the best at the University of Florida, and we're starving for a title. It's been quite a while, but there was a lost decade in between when Dan Mullen stepped in here in 2018. I mean, and this program, we're back to being annoyed that we're not winning the SEC again. And on a serious level, where with McElwain, it was almost astonishing that we somehow won the East in those years. It wasn't like those teams weren't fantastic, and you didn't have heavy expectations heading into those games in Atlanta. With Mullen's teams, he's put us back on the map where we're legitimately contending. And it didn't take till year 3 where he had a breakthrough. It was from day 1 he stepped in. And granted, there are some frustrations with the Mullen era, the ups and downs. We're talking about some of those pressure points today. But I think Mullen deserves this extension. I think it's a good message to send. You heard some of that with the NFL chatter last year. Who knows how much of it was true and how much of it wasn't. But part of the frustration on Mullen's half was that they weren't getting a deal done for him to extend. But I think, like, if this could put some of the NFL talk to bed for the next couple of years, and really focus on some of the weak points of the program right now, really get delivering those high-end recruits. I know that's something you guys talk about a lot on this show, and the minor adjustments that need to be made to take the program to the next level. I'm all for it, and I think it's well-deserved at this point.
Yes, what kind of extending that. No surprise to me that it was announced today with recruiting dead period in, and all these recruits are on campus these next few days. I think that was purposely, as Will said, it was requested that these contracts be released. It was signed back in May, but I don't think it was by a coincidence that it was announced today as recruits are on campus, making their way to campus these next few days, next couple weekends as well for the first time in a year. As I said, I'll go back. This was determined a year ago after Dan Mullen's first 2 successful seasons that he was going to get an extension, been delayed, just now announced a year later. So
didn't they delay the NCAA violation announcements, Dave, last year? Wasn't that like a whole thing where it was buried? Like the leak-proof system that Scott Strickland seems to have built within his athletic department is pretty incredible. Some politicians need to give him a call about that.
Yeah, that whole NCAA thing with Mullen, it was announced with Jimbo, which is it's the same exact scenario. I think a couple months before. So that is kind of funny there how Florida is being putting a lock on things they want to put a lock on for a certain amount of time before they release it. But yeah, I just the whole. I don't understand why I got it. That kind of does rub me wrong. I completely see why, especially going back to a year ago when it was really decided that he was going to get the extension of why it was there. So we'll see. I think it's a good move. The NFL talk, as Will brought up a good point. I didn't know that about the NFL contracts, Will, where it would rank in NFL money wise for Dan Mullen.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. One is Matt Hayes is probably really disappointed this extension came along because he's been one of the guys who's sort of been reporting on the grumbling within the program about Mullen. But the other thing is that, because of some of the quirkiness of Mullen, there are some people who look at it and say they want somebody who is more stately, maybe in that role at the head. But at the end of the day, I mean, Nick said it best. We're actually the expectations are that we're going to compete for an SEC championship, and those expectations may not be on a yearly basis, but it's at least the expectations for this program that just weren't there when Will Muschamp was there and weren't there when Jim McElwain was there. We were hoping we'd have the ability to compete, but that wasn't an expectation. Now it's an expectation, and the question that people ask whenever, or at least that they should ask whenever you talk about replacing a head coach, is who are you going to go get? And there aren't a whole lot of guys you're going to be able to get who are better than Dan Mullen. Does he have some warts? Absolutely. Are there things we think he could do better? I think some of the timeout usage in the Alabama game is something that I hope he improves on and thinks about and decides to get better. I think the recruiting obviously is something we harp on a lot and something that can improve. But at the end of the day, you're talking about a guy who on every list is listed in the top 10 coaches of college football. The fact that he's being paid like a top 5 coach really just makes it clear to your recruits that this guy's going to be there for the next 4 years. And, you should have a long runway to commit.
Yeah. And after watching no offense for the better part of a decade, it's been a blast watching Gator football again. And Rick Gilbert can have fun with his 3 targets per game up in Athens for the next year.
I was wondering how long it was going to take to get the shot in. Not long. 14 minutes into the episode. There we go. Oh, man. But yeah, I mean, Dan Mullen's done about, even given the disappointing end of 2020, has done about everything asked so far through his 3 years. That's counting the disappointing 2020. I know how disappointing it was. It was very disappointing for me as well. We'll see what the future holds there, but it does send a message that Scott Strickland believes the future's strong with Dan Mullen. And we'll get into the future a bit here and transitioning to the theme of this episode here of pressure points for the 2021 season. These pressure points can either be a detriment as Florida moves forward, or it can set up for a future here. So, guys, I think the big one here, and I think where we should start, I think it's number one on everybody's mind. I even see it in the YouTube chat right now. Todd Grantham's name. Todd Grantham's name is brought up over and over and over again. That, to me, is pressure point number one. deciding to bring back Todd Grantham and what that means for the 2021 defense. Who knows? They're going to be better. There's no way they can be worse. I know we said that about the Florida offense for years, and they found a way to be worse, but I don't see that happening again with the Florida defense. So we'll start there. That's pressure point number one. And because there is some pressure there of, hey, Dan Mullen, this is your decision. You decided to bring back Todd Grantham for one more season after giving the historical ugliness that we saw that defense put on the field in 2020. And, a lot of people go back and say, hey, it held Florida down. Florida had a chance for a championship. They had the offense for it. The defense was not there. It held Florida back from a championship, giving up historical point totals, yard totals, holding Florida back from so much more. And you would have not batted an eye had Dan Mullen made the move to get rid of Todd Grantham. I don't think anybody would have batted that eye. Look, I was on the Grantham train. We said it many times going into last season. I thought this had the chance to be Todd Grantham's best defense at Florida. Imagine how disappointed I was in seeing that defense rolled out on the field week after week after I thought that could be possibly the best defense he had with his recruits. All those athletes that I thought were coming back, had experience, the young athletes that I thought would get more playing time on the field. I thought it was a really good mix of talent, and then we saw how that ended up. So now we go into 2021. You get 2 games to kind of warm up before the Alabama game. Look, those 2 games are not going to matter anything in Gator Nation's eyes. It doesn't matter if Florida wins those first 2 games 49-0. It's all going to matter when Alabama rolls into town week 3, because go back to Grantham in 2018, but go back to Grantham in 2019, 2020 threw that out the window because it was all bad. But in 18 and 19, it was, all right, the defense is there, but they're missing those big games. They're missing those big opportunities. Your big game is week 3 coming up this season, Will.
Yeah, I mean, the Grantham thing is interesting. I mean, I think we all raised our eyebrows when Mullen kept him. The loyalty is admirable, but I think the loyalty also, the pressure point here is that there's enough vitriol already that that you start doubting the decision-making process if things don't get better, right? And I'm sure that the defense is going to get better in 2021. Like you said, it can't get worse. At the same time, if it doesn't, or if Grantham continues to struggle in games against elite level talent, which was the criticism in 18 and 19, was against LSU, against Georgia, against against teams that had quarterbacks who were experienced, when they couldn't get pressure, the defense just got picked apart. If that happens again in 2021, well, now you've got people, you're going to get some division. You're going to cause a fissure in the fan base, really, when it comes to people's confidence. You can already feel it a little bit, just because there were people who were so anti-Grantham that they've sort of started to really look at Mullen a little bit side-eye. And, again, I think based on what he's done over the last 3 years, that's not necessarily warranted. At the same time, keeping Grantham after a year like last year is because a year like that is possible, then it means that Mullen can put together the best offense in the world, and Florida may still struggle to win the championship. I think we all have confidence that he's going to be able to put together an offense that's championship level, but he's going to have the defense to match it. And, even when Grantham came, my initial thoughts on him were, he's all right. He's not a difference maker. And even in 18 and 19, that was still my impression. Yeah, they got a lot of sacks. Yeah, they caused a lot of havoc against the Kentuckys and the Vanderbilts of the world. But when it came time to get pressure against LSU, or when it came time to get pressure against Georgia, Florida just wasn't able to do it. And so that's really the thing that I think for Grantham especially is the thing that people are looking for. So you point to the Alabama game. Yeah, they need to get pressure, right? Alabama has a bunch of guys on the offensive line who are highly rated, and Florida's going to have to get by them. And if they just get stoned, or if they get blown back and can't stop the run, or if Alabama's quarterback has all sorts of time to pick and choose and just sort of pick the defense apart, well, I mean, yeah, that falls on Grantham because he's responsible for the recruiting. He's responsible for the scheme. And then that ultimately falls on Dan Mullen because he's the one who decided to keep Grantham there this year.
Nick, we've asked this question before here on the podcast. Is there any saving grace for bringing Todd Grantham back?
Well, if you phrase it that way, it's a lot more difficult to answer. But I'll say this. This is where I came on when I was on in January. We were talking about Grantham, and I said the unforgivable part for me is that this defense if they just had to be okay, and you're probably winning at least an SEC title, maybe a national title, they were so horrible across the board. And there were games where you just felt like this defense was just helpless. I mean, the first half of the Alabama game, for example, granted the team dug deep. They had a nice second half, and it ended up being a fun game to watch. But there were times last year where you just were, I've never felt that way watching Florida football. Even in some of our rougher seasons, the defense has always been okay. But we're 6 months removed from that, right? Where we got room to breathe, room to think about it. And it's not the man's first year. It wasn't the man's first year at Florida in 2020. It was his third season. In the first 2 seasons, he comes in with a defense that's not his, it's just, picking up the pieces from someone else. And he puts in basically a middle-of-the-road defense in most statistical categories, the major statistical categories. But in 2019, they were second in every category. I'm talking about total yards, total pass yards, rush yards, and points per game. Like, they were second place in most of those categories except for pass yards. They were fifth in the conference. And I think that's something that speaks to, you saw major improvements, especially in the rush yards allowed from 2018 to 2019. And I think last year was the whole stew. What didn't add up last year. It just didn't work last year. And I'll tell you, Dave, they gave up 30.8 points per game, which was 8th in the conference. So kind of middle of the pack of a 14-team conference, right? But that was up from 14.4 in 2019 and 20.4 his first year. But I'll say this too, you got to look across the board. What happened in 2020? You couldn't hit. So in 2018 and in 2019, only 2 teams gave up more, each year. 2 teams in 2018, 2 teams in 2019 gave up more than an average of 30 points per game. Last year in 2020, 8 SEC teams gave up more than an average of 30 points per game. So what's the common thread there? No hitting in the offseason, right? I mean, it's a lot of things went wrong, but they still were second in the conference in sacks, and they were in the middle of the pack with interceptions with 8. But we usually see those number, at least the interception number, a little higher with this defense. So when you talk about there's nowhere to go but up, I don't think you're just being a homer, crossing your fingers and hoping here. Really, there is almost nowhere to go but up in all of these categories next year.
Yeah, and I think of course the question is how far up, and how far up will be good enough. I mean, that's according to what the offense does as well on the other side of the ball. If the offense can keep pace, and I'm not expecting a 2020 pace, but if the offense is still good, staying on the field, converting third downs, and they're on the field, and this defense takes it a step forward, then you can expect a nice pairing on both sides of the ball that can really, really help this team. So I don't think they have to go out there and be a top 10 defense. I think that's kind of, put this way, no team really makes that jump. And look, maybe 2020 was just some outlier and some weird season that we do see some kind of jump like that, and Florida rebounds, and that defense is there. But go to Will's point a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's worth bringing up again. I think we all expect in some kind of way this is Todd Grantham's final season at Florida, whether it be he have enough success and he finds another job, or it doesn't work out and they go ahead and make that move. He's in the final year of his contract. Look, all these contracts got announced today. Todd Grantham's name wasn't on one of them.
Well, and the good news is that Florida clearly has enough money that if they decide they want to make a separation, they can make that happen, right? I mean, nobody's coming to Florida because of Todd Grantham, really, when it comes down to the recruiting pitch, right? The pitch is Mullen, the pitch is offense, the pitch is the consistency of the program, the pitch is, returning to the glory of Urban Meyer and those sorts of things, if you want to sell it that way. I think that was yeoman's work by Nick there, trying to make the case for Grantham being able to bounce back. I mean, he's going to bounce back some, just from the standpoint of, I think they're going to have more bodies. Like all the practice that they've had in the spring, there's going to be an option if people struggle like they did last year. It didn't feel like they had any options when, especially the cornerbacks were struggling. But, again, it sort of boils down to the defensive tackles are the key to his offense, or the key to his defense. So bringing in Shelton, bringing in Newkirk, a real step up from Dexter, those are going to be the things that are keys to being able to free up those linebackers to roam. And last year, the defensive tackles really weren't able to hold up well enough. The linebackers got mauled, and that left the defensive backs in a compromised situation. And it wasn't just against, Alabama and Georgia last year where that happened. It was against Vanderbilt. It was against Missouri. It was in those games where that you really shouldn't get beaten up front. They were getting beaten up front. They were struggling to line up. I mean, obviously that's something that you look at and say the other programs aren't having that issue. Why is this program having that issue? So, I mean, again, I understand why people were frustrated with Grantham, but I think the point that you make, Dave, is great, which is that, if Florida's defense improves and is top 20, top 30, Grantham's going to have a job someplace else as a head coach probably. And if Florida struggles, then they'll be able to move on after the season. So the only thing I really worry about with Grantham is if Florida gives up 45 points to Alabama in the swamp, that then sort of the stink that's attached to Grantham right now within the fan base may start transferring over to Mullen, and that's something that he's got to watch out for.
I think to Will's point there, Dave, also, I'm throwing out stats and totals and everything, but if you hold Vanderbilt to 220 yards, and what are you giving up against LSU? Are we giving up 600 plus yards in that LSU game? So that the matchups do matter as well. Just looking for some optimism. That's all.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it goes back to Grantham's history as well. I mean, everybody remembers this time at Georgia because Florida played them every year. And you had a good, steady defense from 2010 to 2012. That 2012 defense was really good. Carried Georgia all the way to the SEC championship game, almost the upset of Alabama that year, and then completely fell off the face of the earth in 2013. So, and it's like we're seeing the same thing at Florida. It's a good start, and then for whatever reason, he gets his players in, players with more experience in his defense, and inexplicably the defense gets worse. So I think that's a lot of the worry there. You're bringing back a coach who has a track record of where he's been, for whatever reason, it gets worse. And then you had an absolute worst of a season that you could possibly have on defense, and you bring him back anyway. So that's one pressure point, I think, and probably the one we should start with because that seems to be the hottest topic for the Gators and a place to improve and what actually happened in bringing back the defensive coordinator that was responsible for that. So, guys, I think next pressure point we should probably start with, and that's, look, this is Dan Mullen's roster. All these draft picks that Florida has sent to the NFL these past few years, besides Kyle Pitts, Jim McElwain players. And look, Dan Mullen gets a whole lot of credit for getting the highest drafted tight end ever to go in the NFL draft. And everybody else, all those receivers that we love to laud and give this team a whole lot of credit for, Jim McElwain's players. So this is his team. This is a team built in Dan Mullen's image through recruiting these last few years and now cycling through Jim McElwain's players that you had a lot of success with. One pressure point is, look, now these are your players, and specifically at quarterback. This is Emory Jones, the first quarterback you signed in your first class. This is the quarterback that you handpicked in your first recruiting class that is, going to be now the quarterback that's going to lead the way after going from Felipe Franks to Kyle Trask and now Kyle Trask to Emory Jones. And on that topic, a lot of people say Dan Mullen got lucky in a way with Felipe Franks going down and Kyle Trask being unearthed and going and being the Heisman Trophy finalist in 2020. That's, I think, something worth pointing up when we talk about Dan Mullen's roster, his quarterbacks is, what happened of Felipe Franks going down and Kyle Trask. Why wasn't Kyle Trask in there to begin with? So I think that is kind of one pressure point to bring up. It is his roster, and specifically at the quarterback position, Will, this is your quarterback handpicked to lead the team.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Corral, Matt Corral, who wound up at Ole Miss, was the guy who was committed to Florida when he came in. And we've already seen Corral have a big year last year. I actually think Corral had one of the better years last year, other than his game against Arkansas, of any quarterback in the country. And so that's what Emory Jones is going to be compared with. At least that's who I'll be comparing him with. Those guys are the same class. You got Lane Kiffin on one side, you got Dan Mullen on the other, and you can start looking at those guys and saying, how do they compare? The other thing is that the offense is going to change to meet the personnel that Mullen has brought in. And so it's going to be interesting to see how he's able to do that. I mean, I don't think even Dan Mullen suspected that in 2019 when Felipe Franks went down, that he was going to find a guy who could play as well as Kyle Trask did. I mean, I think he clearly saw that Trask won the battle in camp. And I think we all sort of saw Trask came in and took that as a negative to Emory Jones. But it turns out Kyle Trask is a really good quarterback, right? And so maybe that's not a negative for Emory Jones. Maybe it's that Kyle Trask was so good they couldn't keep him on the bench anymore. And Emory Jones then just had to sit and wait his turn. And we've seen his ability to throw downfield. He certainly has an arm that and seems to be pretty accurate on those downfield throws. I think the intermediate throws are the area where he still sort of has to prove that he can be accurate enough to really move the ball downfield consistently, but he's proven that he can run the ball. And even when the defense knows he's running the ball, that he can gain yards. And so it's going to be a very different offense. But like you said, it's going to be Dan Mullen's offense. I mean, it's really going to be his offense with his handpicked players and his handpicked offensive line, right? These are going to be guys, you no longer have Stone Forsythe. You no longer have Brett Hagee. Now you're looking at Garage. You're looking at White. You're looking at Reese and DeLance. Those are guys who really are Mullen guys. And we'll see. We'll see what they're able to do.
Nick, we'll get into the offensive line for the next pressure point, but we were talking behind the scenes, and you brought up something interesting in looking at Mullen's roster, and something I could have brought up right then, but I didn't want to take your glory away.
To me, what point are you talking about specifically here, Dave?
No, the transfers.
Oh, right. Well, of course, you got the transfers on the roster in general are a big deal, but in terms of the quarterback position here with Emory Jones coming in for his first year, the one thing that's going to be interesting to see added back to Mullen's offense is the running game with the quarterback, and we saw that at Mississippi State, guys. Like since he's come to Florida, Gator quarterbacks, and of course, 2 of his years have been primarily with Kyle Trask, so you know, take it with a grain of salt. But Florida quarterbacks have rushed for a total of 408 yards and 14 touchdowns. The lowest total of rushing yards at Mississippi State he had, like in the last 5 years at Mississippi State with Dak and Fitzgerald, was 588, and that was Dak's senior year where they're protecting him a little bit. But other than that, the quarterbacks in his offense were up closer to 1,000 yards. Fitzgerald rushed for 1,300 yards, almost 1,400 yards, and 16 touchdowns in 2016. So you're going to see that we saw 43 passing TDs out of Trask last year with 3 rushing TDs for a total of 46. I think Emory can get up toward that 40 range when you factor in how many rushing yards and rushing TDs he's going to have in this offense.
Thinking 30 passing, 10 rushing.
Yeah, and that's honestly like where most of his quarterbacks are closer to. It's mostly the 25 mark in TDs for passing, like around the 20 to like. I mean, Fitzgerald had 15 his last year at Mississippi State, but you see Franks at 24, Trask at 25 that first year. So I think if you saw like a 25-15 split, I think that you'd see an offense that's still cooking at a pretty high level.
Guys, do you think we could see that used against Mullen? I mean, look, this team is losing a lot of talent. They're losing a transcendent quarterback. They're losing a transcendent Kyle Pitts. They're losing Kadarius Toney, who burst onto the scene in 2020. Could he get judged too harshly that, all right, this is your team and it's not a team that's winning the East, or it's not a team that's beating Georgia? I mean, if this team goes 9-3 or 8-4, how much would we see? I think the fan base out there, maybe even from us as well, saying, hey, why could you do it with Jim McElwain's players but not your own?
Yeah, I don't think you're going to hear that from me. I've been saying pretty much since the Oklahoma game that this is a rebuilding year. And I believe that, right? I believe that there are reasons to believe that the defense, while young, still probably needs some time to develop. I think, again, Emory Jones, because he hasn't gotten a large opportunity to be in there and play, because they're playing Alabama this year. And so you've got that early game where let's be honest, Florida is not going to be favored in that game. I mean, maybe they pull it off, but they're not going to be favored. And then you've got Georgia
plays a part in that too.
What's that?
Yeah, schedule plays a part in that too.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason people picked Florida in the East last year wasn't because they thought Kyle Trask was going to win the Heisman. The reason they picked Florida is because Georgia had to play Alabama. And they figured that and they looked at Florida's schedule and said, that one's going to be pretty easy, not really thinking that Texas A&M was going to be as good as they were, but obviously also not thinking LSU was going to be as bad as they were. So this year to
that point, it was Georgia has to play Alabama and will probably lose. They'll probably lose to Florida as well. So Florida had a built-in 2-game advantage right there.
Yep, and then the loss to LSU meant they won on tiebreakers.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it depends on what you're looking for. I mean, it's always a question of expectations, right? If the expectation is that they're going to have a top 20 offense, a top 20 defense, and be competing for the SEC, I think you're likely to be disappointed. Are there scenarios where that happens? Probably, but I think it's more likely that they end up behind Georgia in the East. I think it's more likely that I think a 9-3 season is a lot more likely than a 12-1 season. And so it's a question of expectations. And when I say rebuilding, I don't mean they're going to go 4-8. I mean, you're looking at 8-4, 9-5. You're looking at, or 9-3. You're looking at records that are good but not great as you sort of work through the kinks for some of the younger guys who are coming in from Mullen's recruiting classes. And that doesn't mean that he's not capable of bringing in good talent. In fact, he's upgraded the talent at Florida over Jim McElwain. As much as we harp on recruiting because it's not as good as Georgia and Alabama, it's been better than Jim McElwain. He's raised the overall bar of talent at Florida, particularly when you factor in the transfers. So could he hit lightning in a bottle where Emory Jones plays really, really, really well, and DeMarcus Bowman turns into a star, or Lorenzo Lingard turns into a star, and the offense is unstoppable, the defense improves, and all of a sudden you're beating Georgia again? Sure. But if you were to but that's one of the things about the Florida team. In fact, if you look at the betting odds, you really see this, is that there's a large amount of variance in between where people think Florida is. I think most betting sites have them as like the fourth best team in the SEC, but the over-under in wins is somewhere around the 8 or 9 mark, which tells you that's kind of what the expectation is. Somewhere between 8 and 9 wins is the expectation. If he wins 10, we should say, hey, he exceeded expectations. And then obviously if they go 7-5, then maybe there's some valid criticism there.
Yeah. Nick, Will brought up a good point and something I wanted to bring up. And I had a conversation today and looking at 24/7 Sports Team Talent Composite and how big of we talk on recruiting. Florida's overall talent is higher than it is than it was in 2020. 2021 overall talent composite is higher than it was in 2020. But you have to factor that in with developed players and experienced players, especially what you had at the quarterback position.
Yeah, and I think, we're going to talk about the offensive line shortly, but I mean, that's one position group where not a lot of guys beyond their sophomore year on that line right now. And I think that Mullen, especially on the offensive side, you've just seen a huge difference. Dave, you did mention the transfers here where we talked about there have been some high-level transfers to come in to this program that even though there's been a couple that we're waiting for them to really break out and excel, there's been that a couple guys, you referenced Van Jefferson, John Grenard. There's been a couple guys that Mullen's really hit on too. So this roster overall, I doesn't surprise me that they would be considered more talented overall heading into 2020 just because of what happened with the defense last year, especially up the middle on the defensive side. I think that there was a lot of discord with it just never seemed to get connected. It was never all connected at the same time. And injuries we had some untimely injuries on a couple different things too. I think the defensive side is, if they can raise that play to the middle level, I think you're still going to see a pretty elite offense in the SEC, despite breaking in Emory Jones as the new quarterback, despite breaking in some new offensive line starters this year. And really a lot of talent. We got guys that need to prove themselves out wide, even though we believe in the talent. They haven't necessarily put up the numbers, but you saw a guy like Kadarius Toney, guys can pop on this roster real quick. Kadarius Toney, I don't think we thought he was going to have the type of season he had in 2020 before the first game against Ole Miss.
Yeah.
The other thing.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is that from the standpoint of the offensive firepower, you're losing Brian Johnson too. And so you're losing a guy who's been the quarterback coach there at Florida and was really and then was promoted to offensive coordinator and was given a lot of autonomy. And I know it's Dan Mullen's offense, and I know that makes a difference. At the same time, for him to trust somebody enough to make them the offensive coordinator really says something about how highly he thought of for Brian Johnson. I know that when you talk to the different players or when you listen to what they've said about Brian Johnson, that was somebody that they really respected, somebody they really appreciated, somebody who probably dealt with some of the aggressive coaching that Dan Mullen has with quarterbacks and was able to be sort of a counterweight to the criticism that were coming their way. It'll be interesting to see how the new dynamic is with the new quarterback coach and whether that has any impact as well, because the quarterback coach and the offensive coordinator need to sort of be your confidant, need to be somebody you can bounce something off of. And Brian Johnson was really good at that. And so I don't know that we should completely dismiss the fact that he's leaving. Now, granted, it's not a situation like LSU where, Joe Brady leaves and everything falls apart for various reasons. But I do think that it's a significant loss for Florida. There's a reason they got hired into the NFL. It's because he's a really good coach.
And I think pressure point overall, and Nick, you brought it up with transfers and all that. This is a big year for transfers. The 2 defensive tackle transfers that you brought in, dating back to last year, Lorenzo Lingard. We need to see something from Lorenzo Lingard. DeMarcus Bowman, hopefully he's healthy coming out of spring. 5-star running back. You got 2 5-star running backs you're going to be looking at to make some kind of impact. And given Dan Mullen's history, that says, okay, we should expect some of these transfers to contribute somewhat and probably pretty significantly on the offensive side of the ball with those 2 running backs, given Trevon Grimes and Van Jefferson. But we like you said, Nick, we saw what Jonathan Grenard, even in Adam Schuler, who was a very serviceable SEC defensive lineman a few years ago that contributed very nicely for Florida. I mean, this is a big year for transfers in Dan Mullen. 2 and Todd Grantham, 2 on the defensive tackle, and those 2 running backs. I mean, you go and look at it. We laud Dan Mullen for his work in the transfer portal. I think we're even, this is going to be a big year, 2021, in how much we still put stock in the transfer portal.
Yeah, Bowman and Lingard, you definitely want to see something from them this year. I know guys in year 1, like Mullen, takes time to usually phase guys in. That's something you guys have definitely talked about a lot. Definitely, that's definitely the pattern. But a guy who jumped in immediately last year along the offensive front there, Stuart Reese. Are we going to see a little bit of improvement on that side right there? Technically Delance transfer from Texas too, right? So we see a lot of this roster impacted by it, but it's really about the transfers playing to the level. If you're a 5-star transfer, are you going to play like that 5-star guy when you get in? I thought Brenton Cox is a good case study where you definitely see the talent on the field. The guy gets off the line so fast. There's plays where he's in the backfield while it seems like people are still getting out of their stance. And I mean, even had I think Todd McShay during one of the games would say this guy's by far the best athlete on the field, and it's very clear too. But you also see him kind of overrun plays at time, and it's not a total package just yet. So despite the talent, you're not necessarily getting that level of 5-star production and quality, if that makes sense there. But I'd like to see definitely a guy like just everything come together a little more this year. But definitely, I think the one guy, if you want to identify up front on the defensive side, with Shelton and Newkirk coming in. Let's hope that gets solidified because that was a huge problem last year. But Bowman on the offensive side of the ball, everything you read about the guy, I mean, let's hope we get to see a lot of Bowman early.
And I'll preview it. I think we're going to do our annual preseason magazine episode in a couple of weeks. But I've picked them up, just been looking through them. The preseason magazines love them some Brenton Cox. And I know Gator fans are kind of just ho-hum on Brenton Cox. He's done some good, but I still think we're waiting for that, living up, like as you said, for these 5-star transfers to live up to that 5-star billing. But I tell you what, these preseason magazines list him high up there in kind of SEC rankings, surprisingly. So he's getting a lot of love out there outside of Gator Nation.
Justin Shorter's a guy I want to throw out there too. I did not mention Justin Shorter, but let's throw a guy like that out.
What are we talking? We're talking what, 6, 7, 8 transfers here that are going to be or need to be big time contributors for 2021 to be a success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so when you're talking about Cox, I think one of the things that I go back to is an article Bill Sykes wrote for Read and Reaction a while back where he talked about clustering. And one of the things that maybe is a positive for the defense this year is that all the guys who are being picked for all SEC, all the guys who are going to be preseason all SEC are going to be guys like Kaiir Elam, guys like Brenton Cox, guys like Ventrell Miller. Pretty much everybody that you might think of is going to be on the defensive side of the ball. And Bill's point was that you need to cluster all SEC talent to really compete for an SEC title. But perhaps the benefit is with Mullen on the offensive side of the ball, if they're clustering the talent on the defensive side of the ball all at once, then maybe that's the case for having the year and then having a good year and then the the offense will sort of take care of itself if he can figure out how to make DeMarcus Bowman into the star everybody thought he was going to be a year ago when he decided to go to Clemson and everybody was bummed out. So, there's a path where this team, where the defense sort of clusters all those all SEC guys together, get them to hit all at the same time. But to Nick's point, we haven't seen him hit yet, right? We've seen flashes from Gervon Dexter. We haven't seen consistency. Now, granted, he was a true freshman, but same thing with Brenton Cox, right? We've seen flashes, but we haven't seen him be a star consistently. Diabate, the same way. We've seen flashes. Bogle, we've seen flashes. Carter, we've seen flashes. A little bit more consistent from Carter, but still, it's been more flashes than it has been consistent down to down, constantly dominating. And that's going to be the question to me on the defensive side of the ball. That's actually going to be the question for me on a lot of different places, where there are guys who have shown flashes, but are they actually going to be able to be consistent all 11, all 12 games? And are they going to be able to are they going to be able to use their athletic ability to succeed against the big boys when you get a game against Alabama, game against Georgia, game against LSU?
Good stuff. Good stuff. I didn't even think about, when we were thinking transfers, about how many I actually think Florida's going to rely on in 2021. That is a big, that's going to be a big number.
Yeah, and again, so many of these guys, their talent is evident. It's clear to see why Justin Shorter was a 5-star kid coming out, right? I mean, Cox and I mean, even Lingard had 2 carries against Vanderbilt, and I think Will's still talking about those carries right now, about his explosiveness. I mean, the talent is clear, but is it going to show up on that stat sheet? And like Will said, week in and week out against the big boys, that's what's going to matter.
Absolutely. You get all those 5 stars to show up in big games, and a lot of them are transfers. So that's what we need to see in those big games for sure. Last one here, and kind of goes toward Will's latest, that read and reaction that got ratioed on Twitter, as Will said. So we'll get into that. And offensive line development has been a big topic these last couple of years, after a pretty good 2018, where I'd say the offensive line was actually a pretty good strength for this Florida team, at least toward the end of the year. That offensive line, to me, was a strength. We have not seen 2018 be used as a springboard for the offensive line. A change in offense can be contributed to that a little bit as well, but the development there and lack of recruiting, you've had some guys signed, never even show up to campus, never even play it down for Florida. That needs to be looked at, but we're looking strictly on the field right now and just a lack of development. And I know, and when we brought this up plenty of times, I know, Nick, when you were on the first time, we hope this shift in the offensive philosophy, more of a run style attack, it suits a player like Gene DeLance. It suits a player like Stuart Reese, who played in what we think is going to look like a Mississippi State similar offense, and an offense that he played in under Dan Mullen early in his career. We hope it suits players like that. But Florida, Nick, and you pointed to it, Florida's really young along the offensive line. You have some experienced players, but pretty young overall there on the offensive line. And, Will, when you look at it, man, I mean, John Hevesy, 2 years now, he's gotten a reputation for being able to develop, maybe dating back to his Mississippi State days. But these last 2 years hasn't really shown a lot of promise in this offensive line becoming a strength for this Gators team again. And maybe the shift in offensive philosophy will help this group.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of the point of the article. I appreciate you mentioning that. Lots of people retweeted it on Twitter. I'm not sure they actually read the article. They just saw the headline where I said DeLance might be the strength of the offensive line and said, well, that's a problem. I'm not going to read it. But look, here's the deal. I mean, the guy was the 117th overall recruit in the class of 2016. You don't get rated that high as an offensive lineman without having reasonable amounts of talent. Now, that talent hasn't necessarily translated yet, especially in pass protection. But when you go back and you look, you can actually see improvement in pass protection throughout the year. I think he got injured about halfway through the year, because you can start to see his athleticism sort of wane. And then the other thing is when you really actually start looking at the numbers. So SEC StatCat has a great way to break these things down. But if you look at inside left, Florida averaged 3.8 yards per carry. They averaged 4.5 yards per carry inside right. And when you got to third down, inside left, 3.8 yards per carry, 4.9 inside right. So when they ran behind DeLance, they were able to get almost more than a yard more per play. You saw it against Georgia. There were a bunch of short yardage plays where they ran directly behind Delance. And the other thing is with a right-handed quarterback, oftentimes you run that read option with the running back going to the left anyway, and then the quarterback comes back to the right. Well, last year that quarterback coming back to the right was Kyle Trask. He wasn't really a threat to take it to the house. This year, the quarterback coming back to the right is going to be Emory Jones, and he is a threat to take it to the house. And I do think that Delance's strength is clearly being a road grader and being a guy who's used to help run the ball. But Florida only ran the ball 40% of the time last year. And if you go back to 2018 and look at what they did with Felipe Franks, quarterback, they ran the ball like 58% of the time. And so if they do that, they're going to be playing to the strengths of a guy like Delance, somebody who does seem to be a better run blocker than he is a pass blocker, at least for last year. Again, I think he's going to have to improve in pass blocking. I think we maybe underrate the fact that the offensive line with Reese and Delance over there on the right-hand side didn't have a spring practice to sort of get used to each other. You had Ethan White go out early in fall camp, which meant they had to juggle guys around, bring Hagee to center, even though he was going to play guard, and then he had Garage come in at guard. So they had a bunch of things changing on the offensive line there in the fall. And then you had the COVID outbreak with Texas A&M. And I'll tell you, I had it 3 months ago. I still don't feel right. And I don't want to use that as an excuse, but I do think that sometimes we don't necessarily take that into account when we look at how these guys played. So was Delance great last year? No. Do I think he's going to get drafted high in the NFL next year? No, I don't. But I think he's a decent right tackle when you put him in the right scheme. And I think that Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts and Kadarius Toney dictated that they wound up having to put Delance in the wrong scheme. I think Emory Jones, DeMarcus Bowman, Lorenzo Lingard, Malik Davis are probably going to dictate that they're in a scheme that's much more built around the types of things that Delance and Reese do well.
Nick, is it could it be? I don't know. I mean, I hate calling for coaches' heads. That's just something I don't like doing here. But would it be time if we see a 2019-2020 offensive line performance? Would it be time to move on from John Hepazee?
Well, I think he's a guy that was with Meyer and stayed with Mullen throughout a lot of his career here. I really it's the answer is it depends. I mean, it really depends on what type of development we're seeing out of younger guys too, because if Delance continues to struggle, but someone like Garage steps in and it looks brilliant, how do you evaluate that? So Ethan White, is he going to stay? Are guys staying healthy? Who's taking over? Do we 100% know who's taking over at center just yet? How does Braun look coming in? And really, as long as you have faith that he can continue to develop these young guys, and maybe that's an area of that we need to work on in the recruiting cycle too, in terms of getting top tier talent. I know Will and I were talking in a couple weeks ago, and I pointed out that since 2013, Alabama has had 6 offensive linemen, and I pick Alabama because they're the gold standard, right? Like 6 offensive linemen drafted in the first round. Florida, you have to go back to Mo Collins in the 1998 NFL draft. Like it was like the 24th pick to the Raiders or something like that. But 1998 NFL draft with Mo Collins for the 5th Florida offensive lineman who was drafted. If you count backwards, 5 Florida offensive linemen who were drafted in the first round. So we're putting out defensive linemen in the first round, but we're not getting those elite offensive line talent. So unless we've had a problem developing offensive line talent for the last 20 plus years, that's not really John Hevesy. I don't know if we're a program where we just focus more on getting the skill guys and the quarterbacks and everything, but it's definitely an area where you got to put some focus on. And if you don't feel like Hevesy is that guy that can get the job done, then obviously you move forward. But I think he's had a job for a long time with some great coaches. So I'd say I'd be a little patient with him, give him a chance to continue to develop this group. But yeah, you're certainly right. If you see the type of struggles and lack of development continue that we've seen to this point, I don't know how much it's Hevesy's fault though that there's injuries along the line with some of these guys. So let's see these young guys get in and see how they perform. I'm particularly looking forward to White and Braun this year. Definitely want to see if those guys can pop a little bit. So
if he's not getting rid of Grantham, he's not going to get rid of Hevesy. I mean, out of all the
Good point.
relationships and sort of the
Yeah.
loyalty and how much he likes the different coaches that he's at and how much he respects them. I mean, Grantham came in 2017 to Mississippi State and was able to survive 2020. So Hevesey's got a track record that stretches back 2 decades with Mullen. He's not going anywhere unless it's just an absolute catastrophe. And even in that case, I think he'd probably be given another year.
I mean, that's another, looking at Hevesey, looking at, and Gonzalez, I don't bring him up to say he should be thrown into that category, but he is in the buddy system with Mullen, but he's more than proven his worth to be a mainstay on this coaching staff. But, that is a critique of Mullen, is just being too friendly, too buddy with staff members and not making the move. And we hope that's not a too little, too late kind of thing, and that happens to coaches sometimes. They hang on to their assistants too late. And I do think, with another subpar performance in 2021 with this offensive line, you really have to sit down and see what the issues are. Can it get any better? But kind of going to Will's point, I didn't really think about it that way. Yeah, if you're not firing Grantham after 2020, what in the world is going to make you get rid of Hevesey? if the offensive line is not going to be any worse than what the 2020 defense was, and if you want to compare it that way, Hevesey's going to be around here for at least a few more seasons.
Do you feel like Mullen thinks he can coach around that too? Because the game I go to in my memory is the 2018 game in Starkville. You remember how many that defensive front that Mississippi State had coming into that game, and you're just like worried. I was worried we were going to get chewed up by that front, and I think they have 2 first-round draft picks off that front, and I mean just Simmons and who ended up in Washington. I'm like, Sweat, yeah, fantastic group at Mississippi State, and of course Mullen knew them intimately because it was his first year in Gainesville. How many bubble screens did we see throughout that game? That was a crazy amount. I mean, I feel like Mullen just thinks he can coach around it to an extent too, and to an extent he can. maybe not against the Alabamas of the world, but he can get the job done on most Saturdays.
The other thing is, what are you trying to improve? And I hear a lot of people talk about not seeing improvement on the offensive line, and then they immediately go to recruiting. But, programs like Alabama churn through assistants and the recruiting's still awesome. Programs like Georgia churn through assistants and the recruiting's still awesome. Programs like Ohio State under Urban Meyer churn through assistants and the recruiting was still awesome. So I think at the end of the day, the recruiting aspect of this is really on Mullen. Like, the head guy sets the tone for recruiting. And for the most part, you get these guys, Saban was a great recruiter at LSU, leaves for the NFL, comes back, and a lot of the guys on that LSU staff had become head coaches by the time he comes back to Alabama, guys he's competing against, and he still whips them on the recruiting trail. And so, I think what you want to do is make sure you're evaluating Hevesey on the improvement you see for the offensive line on the field. Because at the end of the day, I don't think the recruiting is going to get better, or at least significantly better, by bringing in a different offensive line coach. I think the only reason you would make a change is if you thought that the guys weren't developing the way that you think they should. And everybody was going to get a pass after the COVID year, I think, which is, again, maybe that's the reason, the difference between, holding on to Grantham and potentially making a change. But we're also talking about making a change before we've even played the season. And I actually do anticipate that the Florida offensive line is going to be better this year. I think it's going to be better because it's going to be guys who've had a full spring, a full offseason with Nick Savage, a full fall camp where they can really identify not just the top 5 guys, but they can identify the top 7 or 8 guys. And when somebody makes a mistake, like that game against Tennessee where Delance didn't move at the snap and the defensive end whips around the corner and drills the quarterback, and even to a lesser extent, and this is an offensive line play, but the shoe throwing incident against LSU where Marco's still out there in the next play, like that, the inability to take guys off the field when they made mistakes last year was glaring. And I think there's a perception that was because guys weren't being held accountable, but I think one of the reasons they weren't being held accountable is because there wasn't another guy to put in behind them. So that excuse is gone now, right? We need to see that development, need to see those guys get better. I think we're going to. I think Braun is going to be a pretty good player. I think Delance is going to be better this year. I think Reese is going to be better in his second year in the system. I think Garage is going to be better. And then you've got maybe one spot. Is that Ethan White who's playing left guard? Is there somebody else, Michael Tarquin, somebody like that who can step in? and fill one of those holes. Or maybe it's something where you start rotating guys in and sort of see by the end of the USF game who you want to go with against Alabama. I hope they sort of have it set early in the year and that we've got consistent offensive line play, but there may be a little bit of rotation because they are replacing a lot of guys.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that we said going into when we all three got together right after the season. I was like, I expect the offensive line to be better because of a transition in offense. And I'll stand by that too. I do think they will be better. I mean, just look at Emory Jones and his running success last year. We didn't the offensive line was the same offensive line. Emory Jones still runs for almost 7 yards a carry. I know we could probably make too much of that, but it was inconsistent pretty much throughout the whole year. And don't get me wrong, some of that's Emory Jones and his slipperiness and being able to find the hole and put a foot down and run north and south. But I also think, that helps the offensive line in general too when it's all said and done. So, guys, that was so some good stuff kind of dating back to when we first got together about this offensive line.
Well, it turns out when you don't have a spring game, that all you have to talk about is all the same stuff. Where that's the reality. Is it's just one of those things where we haven't seen them out there, and I think we all have an idea of what we hope to see and what we anticipate might happen. But that's one of the beauties of this fall camp that's coming up. Is I think we'll get a lot more answers as we sort of. As the wrapping paper is taken off of our Christmas gifts, as the real season starts there in August, and then in September when we're able to fully pack the swamp and really enjoy it this year as opposed to last year.
Yeah, some other SEC teams had spring games, and they got to see their team. I'm hoping we've had them before. I'm hoping Mullen opens some practices come this fall, and we get to see a little bit there. But of course, we won't really know much until week 3. Alabama rolls into town. We'll get a lot of answers then, but those first 2 games will be fun. I think we'll see enough to make some summaries until Alabama rolls into town.
I just God help the defense and Todd Grantham those first 2 weeks, so that there's a little bit of positivity heading into that Bama game. Because I'll say, if we go into USF, they had a horrible record last year with Jeff Scott, the OC from Clemson, coming down to Tampa, but they put up some points late. They pushed Memphis, who's a solid team in the American Conference, and then American Athletic, and then UCF they scored a ton of points on too. So if they have like a type of first half where it's a sleepy noon kickoff or something, and they put together a couple nice drives before we wake up, that's going to be a lot of noise heading into that Bama game. But I hope it's two games where the defense completely shuts down a couple of in-state rivals, and we got a lot of confidence heading into Bama.
Can you imagine the level of noise if Florida gives up like 35 points to USF?
That's
my goodness.
We're heading into the season with such angst already. I was telling Will, we need to have there needs to be some kind of ceremony or something, where we just throw a shoe into the ocean to get over the end of last year and just put the emotions of last year behind us and just focus. This is a fresh year, new players, new year. Let's go. It's a totally different team from last year. Let's not carry those last 3 games. I think even you called it a disappointing season at the beginning of the episode, Dave, for 2020. The end of the season was disappointing. This season itself was a lot of fun, though, leading up to it. I mean, A&M was frustrating. Yeah. The end was super disappointing, but the season itself was a fun team to watch last year. And man, I hope we have some good energy heading into that Bama game, because we're gonna need it. We're gonna need it for sure.
Yep. If you guys missed that, 3:30 kickoff for Bama, 3:30 kickoff for Georgia, 7:30 kickoff for the season opener versus FAU, and a noon kickoff the week before Bama in Tampa versus USF. That's gonna be a hot one.
Hot.
Are they going to be allowed to shoot off the pirate ship?
I mean, if we have an option, I don't think so, but if we have an option, we should tell them no, like the Chiefs did in the Super Bowl. Say no. Only if we get it for our scores.
Hi guys, what you guys got coming up?
Yeah, so Nick and I have been doing this show now. It's called Stand Up and Holler. It's sort of a PTI based, or at least it's based roughly around that, where we got four segments that are 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, $1, sort of go back and forth about different things in Gator Nation. So if you go to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel, you can check that out. And then obviously, Dave, you mentioned the article that I put up there today, and still pumping those out, hopefully about once a week now until the season starts.
How about you, Nick?
Yep, I like Will said, stand up and holler, subscribe to we're trying to build up that Read and Reaction YouTube channel. So I know the site's been mostly all writing up until recently, but we're going to try to expand on the digital side too here. And then American Football Stories, check out the American Football Stories podcast. We're on YouTube, and we cover more of college football on a national scene, but we'll certainly be doing a little bit. I know we're going to do a little bit of recruiting stuff with Will and with Read and Reaction, but we'll announce a little more on that at a later time.
Sounds good. So for Will and Nick, I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.